Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you found this stream. Somehow something went wrong. I'm not sure why. And I'm going to try this again. Just bear with me for a second. So hopefully this worked. And now you can see both of my cameras. So that camera is set to record what is on the counter. Again, I'm sorry this worked out that way. Welcome to my first Bake With Me session, and you've noticed that it's the first because the tech is not really fine-tuned. Today we're baking apple cinnamon bread, and we're making it a sourdough bread, of course. And you've received emails already because you signed up, and you've already collected everything you need. You have the recipe. I have the recipe printed out. I should share this in this link just in case you don't have it. Share it here as well as in the comments, so you can just link to it. That's the recipe that we're following today. This recipe was developed over a lot of loaves of bread that friends, family, and neighbors shared, and some of it is still in the freezer, will be eaten. It was all delicious, but I wasn't quite happy with it. This version has a lot more apple in it, and that's the title of today's session, apple bread, and we'll quickly put the dough together so that we have some time to chat between that and adding the salt. So I'm switching over here to my counter camera so you can see what's going on. Here we are. I'm using the Iscali kitchen scale. This is very important and my favorite bowl. The starter I fed this morning at 6, what I usually do on weekends. And so now I'm adding 80 grams of starter to the bowl. The starter is nice and bubbly, has about doubled. We'll talk about starter after we have all of this in here. The starter amount is a little higher in this recipe. And that is a good thing because it is fairly cool here today. So sometimes when it's under 22 degrees in our kitchen, I add a little bit more starter in order to ensure that everything is rising well. Then we add 200 grams of water. Same thing, I'm adding warm water because I want to get the fermentation started. If it's really warm in your kitchen, you can add cold water and slow it down a little bit. In the summer, when it's like over 25 degrees in your kitchen, things will go very quickly, which can be something that we want, we don't. Because we don't want to lose any of the flavors. So we have 200 grams of water. The apples have their own moisture. And so we need to watch out that we don't put too much water in the dough at first. And then I'm using my Danish dough hook. We'll talk about that in between too. Mix all of that up. So for this recipe, I am using medium-sized grated apples. I'll show you one after this. Right now, sunrise apples here in the Okanagan are in season, so I'm using those. But use your favorite baking apple. So we're adding So I use 150 grams of whole wheat flour in this. You can use a bit more, but 150 is what I thought was really good for this loaf. And then I'm adding 350 grams of unbleached whole wheat, unbleached bread flour. Bread flour has a little bit of higher protein and adds for is better for the gluten development. So we're going up to 500 grams of flour. And we do not add any salt at this point. So we only have flour, water, and starter, and apple. Usually my breads at this point only contain flour, water, and starter. But in this case, we're adding the apples already. And we are not adding any salt. So for the first half hour, we're not adding any salt. So salt regulates the growth of yeast cultures, and we don't want that for the first half an hour. We want to get the yeast going. So you see on the camera, you see that it is fairly rough dough right now. That's just fine. It's a little bit on the dry side as far as I can tell right now, but we'll get to that later. So now I'm using a kitchen towel and making it wet. A damp kitchen towel is what I use. So this is the first step. The first step in our process. And now we wait. Now what I do is I actually make sure that I measure out the salt. I do that because then I don't forget it as easy. So it's really easy to forget the salt if you're adding it later. but we certainly don't want to miss that step. So I take a little bowl and I measure out 10 grams of salt. 9 to 10 grams of salt is usually in a 500 grams of flour. So I measure out the salt and put it by the bowl so I won't forget. Yes, and now we're waiting for half an hour. Hey, Google, set a timer for 30 minutes. Okay, so 30 minutes is now what we call the fermentolase. So the yeast and the flour will react. I'm just going to pull up a chair. And talk about a few things. So we call our starter Monster because, like a monster, it needs to be fed all the time, which is kind of an insider joke because, as my t-shirt says, I keep saying, well, I have to remember to feed the starter. The starter is really the heart of the sourdough baking process. And you might have received starter from a friend, you might have made it yourself. I have a course on making your own sourdough starter in the in my website. So let me know in the comments if you need a link and I'll be happy to send it to you. Or you might have your own starter or a starter that you purchased or whatever. So we start with a good, healthy starter. And what is starter? So the air and the wheat contain wild yeast. It's like we breathe yeast all the time. And it's called wild because we don't cultivate it. It's just there. It's just part of the air we breathe. And in combination with these wild yeast strains and the lactobacillus, they create a culture that can digest carbohydrates into and help us create a yeast culture that can leaven the bread. This is something that has been developed. Well, the earliest records of using yeast to leaven bread was in Egypt. So at the beginning of the time when people used to write down their history. So it's a really old system. It has developed over time. And at some point after the Industrial Revolution, people started developing what we call today industrial yeast. So yeast that is produced, especially now the dry yeast that we can get, has the advantage that everything rises a lot faster. It is much more reliable. I don't have to go through all of this. But the main thing is bakers don't have to make it a 2 or 3 day process. So time is money. And that's when you buy an artisan loaf that is 100% sourdough, it's a little bit more expensive because there's more time involved. So the starter, once it's established, it takes a little while. When you have a new starter, you will notice that sometimes things take a little longer, don't turn out as well. After a few weeks, your starter should be more reliable. And I am using my starter pretty much every weekend all year through. And so it really goes, it really is active. So what I do is about Thursday night, Friday morning, I take Monster out of the fridge and I feed it. So I put in, usually I put in equal parts of starter, water, and flour, and mix it up and leave it on the counter. If it is cool in the house, like below 20 degrees, I usually put the starter and my dough into the laundry room, which is a little bit warmer. So that is a bit of something. So I mix it up, and usually within 4 to 6 hours, I come back and I see that the starter has nice bubbles. It is risen at least about half in the jar, and it's ready to use. I like to feed my starter what I mostly use in my bread, and that is at least half whole wheat and half bread flour. Other people prefer to use only all-purpose flour. Other people add some rye. There's different theories. What works for me is that my starter has half whole wheat, half bread flour. It doesn't really rise as high in the jar as I see other people's starter in videos and so on, but it works really well. And that's really the key of doing that. So I feed the starter on Thursday night. I feed it twice a day. So Friday morning and Friday evening, I discard some of the starter, and I keep the discard in the fridge as well to use for other yummy recipes. And I feed the starter again, usually a 1-1-1 ratio, meaning 1 part starter, 1 part water, and 1 part flour. Now, I've heard a lot of people, especially in the summer, they open their starter jar, and rather than kind of a beer yeast smell, it has like an acidic smell. That is usually, or like some people even compare to acetone. That is really a sign that your starter is getting too acidic. And in that case, you can feed it 1 part starter, 2 to 5 parts flour, and 2 to 5 parts water. So equal amounts for 100% hydration starter. And that will take that will definitely take longer to rise and to double. What happens with the starter when it gets going and the cultures digest the carbohydrates and produce gases. So they use the starter gets these gas bubbles in it, and that makes it rise. It's the same in the bread later on. We put ripe starter in there. So basically when the starter culture has used up all the carbohydrates, it starts slowing down. So at this top point, we feed that starter, all that new flour to that starter. So now it can start doing the same thing in our bread dough. And that's where how it leavens. And that's why it needs a little bit of extra time. So let's talk about the ingredients. First of all, for the starter. So we are very lucky in Kelowna. Our city water system does not use any chlorine. So I can use tap water, no problem. If you are concerned about chlorine in your water or anything else, maybe you want to use filtered water or use even bottled water, although that's not the greatest, but filtered water, or take the water out of the tap, let it sit and air out in an open container for 24 hours, and then the chlorine will be dissipated out of the water. So That is one thing. In the beginning of my sourdough journey, I had an old bag of bleached flour. So when you go to the store and the bag that you're picking up in the flour aisle says flour, it is bleached flour. That means that the chemicals that are used to make the flour white faster, are going to kill a lot of the good yeast cultures and other cultures that we need in the bread. So if you go buy flour, by all means buy white flour if you like white bread, but make sure that it is not bleached. Make sure that it is fresh. So like usually there's a date on the flour. If it's not, there's no best before date on it, then it's usually, if the production date is on there, it should be good for a year about. Don't worry if it's a little bit older, it will still work, maybe just not as fast. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. So those ones are the ingredients: flour and water and starter. So that is there. And again, we use unbleached flour. If your starter seems to be a little bit sluggish, you can add some rye flour. That usually makes it, activates it a little bit faster. So that might be one thing. But don't be discouraged if you're starting your sourdough journey and the first couple of loaves don't rise quite as high as you can. One short thing about more flour is this process is not gluten-free. Although, because of the slow fermentation process, a lot of gluten-intolerant people can handle real sourdough bread just fine. I'm pointing out that it's real sourdough because sometimes when you go to the store and you buy sourdough bread, it's actually not really sourdough. It is what we call sour faux, which means that there is some sourdough in it or some sourdough flavoring, but the main ingredient is yeast. It's a yeast bread that tastes like sourdough bread. That one will have a higher glycemic index, just like any other. The real sourdough does produce gluten, and that's what's holding the bread together. But the gluten is less. It's easier to digest, not for celiacs, but for people with the gluten intolerance. So you may want to try a piece of real sourdough bread, and see if your reaction isn't there. Let's see what we have a few minutes. I can go through some of the tools I use. I'm sitting down because I broke my ankle this summer, so I'm trying to stay off that foot. So one thing is this Danish dough hook that I use, and I love this thing. It has replaced the mixer in our kitchen. So go and if this is not a must-have tool, but this is probably the first tool I would give somebody that is starting sourdough baking as a gift. So this is a really nice way to mix up all the flour. It has replaced the mixer. Having said that, if you are experiencing difficulties mixing your dough with your hands, by all means use a mixer, a strong enough mixer to mix all of this up. We don't really need to knead in sourdough baking because the slow fermentation makes all of that work, but it can be a little heavy depending on how many loaves of bread you're baking at a time, and how much water is in your dough. So the next tool is probably the most important. The most important thing you need is a cooking vessel that can withstand at least 500 degrees Fahrenheit in your oven. So I was lucky. We had this IKEA cast iron Dutch oven kicking around in the garden, actually. So I cleaned it up and I seasoned it, and I'm using it every week. So it's really great to use. You can use maybe a regular roasting pan or anything with a lid. So the difference between home baking and professional baking is that, or one of the main differences is that a professional baking oven will have a function where you can inject steam into the oven in the baking process. The steam is needed to raise the bread and make sure that it rises nicely. If we bake at home, if we bake the loaf in a vessel with a lid on, the water that comes out of the dough will produce the steam, or I even often put 2 cubes of ice into the Dutch oven to create that steam. So that steam is important for what we call the oven spring, to make a nice loaf of bread. The other thing you might find if you're reading any recipes online, is people say, okay, put baking paper into parchment paper into the into your vessel and put your bread in. I found that very inconvenient, mainly because at those high temperatures, first you have to have really high quality baking paper, parchment paper. The other thing is that you often can use it only once, so it gets really brittle and it doesn't work very well. So what I found works really well is a baking sling. So this is a silicone material. You can find them on Amazon, or if you want to make your own, you can also find a little course on my website, and there you can make your own, cutting that out. And I use this over and over and over again. So this fits my Dutch oven, and it has 2 handles, so I can put it in the oven. So that is one of the things we need. Let's see where we are with the time. Hey Google, how much time is left on the timer?
There's 12 minutes and 25 seconds remaining.
12 minutes. Okay, we have 12 minutes. That's cool, because I have a few other things to talk about. So I spend a lot of time on social media. I spend a lot of time, especially after I broke my foot or my ankle. I spend a lot of time in sourdough groups, and sourdough people are incessant in talking about sourdough. And there's a lot of talk about the perfect loaf and like different tricks that people use, and discussions about, is this underproofed or overproofed? Is this baked too much or too little? And why doesn't people get really uptight about this. And I do understand if you are baking, if you're baking bread to sell it, or you're especially if you're baking bread to sell it, then you need to have the same bread that you're looking for at the right time in the morning when market day is, or however you sell your bread. And that can be very stressful. My website focuses on home bakers, meaning that you're baking 1 or 2 loaves at a time. I usually bake 1 artisan loaf and 2 sandwich loaves every weekend. You're baking 1 loaf at a time to be used either for you and your family or to give away for friends. That takes the pressure off. If your bread is not exactly picture perfect like it was, you learn what you learn what went wrong. You're still enjoying a good loaf of bread that might be a little denser, might not be as beautiful as you wanted, but it tastes the same and is as healthy as the bread that comes out of the oven. And you just need to take a picture for Instagram and show it to the world. Same goes for scoring. We'll talk about scoring. No, let's talk about scoring. So scoring, that's another tool. When your bread has fermented fully and it goes into the fridge for a cold ferment, I do not ever skip that step. I know some people do. And then it comes out. And then if you would just put that bread from the fridge into the oven without anything, it would just rise and break wherever it wants to. So in order to control this breaking and to make sure that the steam can escape out of the bread, we need to make a little cut into the bread. So that is called scoring. I use this fancy bread lame. It's a French word. The French word is lame. For years, I used to just hold the razor blade in my fingers and do the scoring. Or you can use a sharp knife, maybe with a serrated edge. But that's for that. I do believe I do not really get all into fancy scoring, as I call it. I make a couple of deep enough cuts that control the rise, but I don't make any special figures on the bread and stuff. You find a lot of tutorials on Instagram and YouTube about doing that. By all means, please do it, and please send me a picture. Share a picture of your loaves, either way, how they turn out. So that is the scoring. So I focus on baking healthy bread for my family, baking bread that I want to eat. I have a German background, and in Germany we often eat heartier bread than is usually done in North America. Even my sandwich bread is very hearty. There's a lot of whole grains in there, sometimes nuts, and so on. That's just why I like it better. I don't try to replicate the store-bought Wonder Bread kind of bread where it's soft and fluffy and stuff. Yes, I want to have it tasty, I wanted to have it healthy, and I want to have an even crumb. We call the crumb means that's the inside of the bread. When I cut it open, I open it up and I look at the cut bread, and that's the crumb, the inside of the bread. And I like to see an even crumb, meaning that all the bubbles, all the holes in the bread are evenly spaced. I usually prefer, or we usually prefer, a lower hydration dough bread, meaning that the holes are not as big. You know, when you cut open a tip, like a good baguette, baguette has a very high hydration, so the holes are fairly large. Actually, you probably have more holes than dough in your bread. That's what baguette is supposed to be like. We like our bread a little bit denser is maybe the best word. So a bread with fewer bubbles, or smaller bubbles. So I use a lower hydration, meaning the ratio between water and dry ingredients is under 80%. So in terms of weight, so there's more flour weight than water weight, and that makes for a smaller bubbles. Also, the whole wheat that I use, like the whole wheat content, also makes it rise a little bit less. If you want a really tall bread, use all white bread flour and you'll be very happy. But that's not what I'm after. But you will see that in my recipes that I share, that often they have quite a high whole grain content. If you go and look at my website at some of the posts that I marked fundamental, you will learn more about history and grains and the whole science around sourdough. And I touched a little bit on that when we talked about starter, but it's more scientific there. So I encourage you to have a read there. Okay, I think it is time to mix up our dough, our salt into the dough. Hey Google, how much time is left on the timer?
T-minus 4 minutes and 43 seconds.
4 minutes, that's just fine. I'm just going to switch over to the counter again. Hey Google, stop timer.
All right, the timer is canceled.
So let's see what this looks like. So you see already the flour has already, or the moisture has already hydrated most of the flour. I just sprinkle the salt that I measured, in this case 10 grams, onto the flour, and I start mixing it with my hand. By all means, use your mixer if you need to. It feels a little bit dry, so I'm just taking some water from the into my hand and splash it onto the dough. So this is because we don't know beforehand the moisture content of my apples. So some apples have more moisture. You might have a bigger apple. You might have other things. In the development of this recipe, I had one batch where I added too much water. So the hydration was quite high, so it was really hard to shape, and it stayed fairly flat in the Dutch oven. Even though it was tasty and healthy, it wasn't what I wanted. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of water. You can add water at any time in the process over the next couple of hours. Best time is during the stretch and folds. So make sure that everything is nicely mixed up. And I always say this is as close as I get to kneading. So if you ever see a recipe that says no knead bread, that's all it means is that it's slow fermented. So the fermentation process is taking care of what you would usually do with kneading. So now I close this off. Depending on our house is fairly cool this morning. The temperatures have dropped, fall is coming. And so I am going to put my bread into the laundry room now, where it is about 22 degrees centigrade. That is a nice temperature for the dough to rise. You will get an email from me in about half an hour. And there we will talk about stretch and pull. And there's a video in the email that shows you how to stretch and pull this bread. In this case, I recommend 3 to 4 stretch and pulls. the recipe says every half an hour. If you need to run out and you do it like in a longer interval, that's fine. So what this stretch and pull does is it helps develop the gluten strains. So if you're doing, if you're not, if you don't have the time to do the stretch and folds, your bread might not keep its shape as nicely as otherwise. So we do the stretch and folds 3 to 4 times every half an hour, 45 minutes, or even an hour before we just let the bread ferment the whole time. So tonight you will get an email showing you how to tell if your bulk fermentation is done. So this will also have a little video about the poke test, as I call it. So we poke the dough and see if it's ready to be shaped. And then there's also a video or a clip out of the recipe video where it shows you how to shape the dough. So in that case, you will, like in our case, as the temperatures are today, it will probably be around 9 o'clock tonight, between 9 and 10. And then I spread the apple cinnamon mixture on top of the dough. I fold it up, I roll it up and shape it and put it into the banneton. Oh, we didn't talk about bannetons. This is a banneton, meaning it's just a rattan basket. And my bannetons, or most of my bannetons, have liners in it, cotton liners that I just spread some rice flour on and use that. If you don't have a banneton, they're not expensive, but if you don't have one, you can also use your kitchen sieve like this. Line it with a kitchen towel, spread liberal amounts of rice flour on it. And it's rice flour because it doesn't bond with the, it's not actually a flour, doesn't bond with the gluten in the bread, so it will prevent your dough sticking to the towel. So that's what you do, and after that is shaped, it goes into the fridge, and then we will take it out tomorrow morning. Next live session is at 10 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow morning, and then we'll score the bread and put it in the oven. That one will be a much shorter video because we don't have to wait 40 minutes until the bread is baked. We can we can put the bread in the oven, talk about scoring some more. And I'm happy to answer all of your questions. Either leave them as a comment on the live stream, or send me an email, or comment on my social media accounts, Instagram or Facebook. It's always Sourdough Guide. Sourdough.guide is my website address. You can reach me there. Feel free to ask all the questions that you want. If you need some more help and you need to hop on a video call with me, I'll be happy to do that as well. If you're watching this in a recording, there will be and you're missing all the emails and so on, I will edit together a video that anybody that has signed up to my mailing list will be able to download, or will be able to watch after the fact. Okay, enjoy the rest of your day. Watch for those emails that are coming, and I'll see you tomorrow morning around the same time. Bye.
Awesome.